Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalaraso Apurna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Mudna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Guti Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sivak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Bhatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acaryas, the compiler of this Padyavali, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll resume our discussion of this text. So, in our last reading, some time back, we concluded discussion of the second verse of Shikshastakam, which drew attention to the fact that, or the experience of lacking taste or ruchi or prema for Bhagavan's names as a result of misfortune, durdaiva, which in the course of the commentary we understood to mean aparad. So now, following that citation of the second verse of Shikshastakam, Rupa Goswami next cites the third verse of the Shikshastakam, which is the prescription given by Sriman Mahaprabhu as the means by which one can chant Bhagavan's name free from aparad, or in other words, how one can free oneself from this misfortune and thereby experience prema for Krishna, and by means of that prema, the madhurya of Krishna. So we'll discuss this verse at some length. I wasn't planning on it, but the commentary on this verse has gotten rather elaborate. It's longer than the one on Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavitamati, which I had promised would be the longest. But in the course of preparing this, I found that there were many salient points from the Sandarbhas, from the works of Sanatana Gosvami, and elsewhere that were very relevant to the discussion. And little by little, they got strung together, and I think, although it'll take some time to get through it, it presents many very, very valuable and practical points about the following the path of bhakti and the life of a sadhaka. So I think it's a worthwhile involvement, or a worthwhile use of time to go through many of these salient points given by the Goswamis about how to practically follow the path of sadhana bhakti. So we'll dive into that starting now. So first we'll introduce the verse, then we'll read the verse, then we'll look at each of the four qualities mentioned in the verse individually, and then we'll look at a conclusion that puts all the points together. So, I'll begin. Having thus cited the second verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, wherein the names being a manifestation of Sri Bhagavan's grace is demonstrated by mention of various aspects of its greatness, and an expression of humility is made based on the feeling of a lack of prema for Sri Bhagavan's name as a result of one's past offenses or aparadhas. The compiler next cites the following verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, wherein the proper manner in which the name is to be chanted, whereby one becomes free from offenses and attains prema, is described. In other words, the bearer of eligibility or adhikari for the practice of nama sankirtan is designated in this verse, and the injunction for such a bearer of eligibility to always engage in nama kirtan is given. Sriman Mahaprabhu introduces this third verse of his Shikshastakam in Chaitanya Charitamrita as follows: O Swarup and Ramarai, please listen to the characteristics of the manner by taking the name, the manner of taking the name, by following which prema manifests. It was explained in the second verse of Shikshastakam that there are no rules regarding the time one chants the name. And by reference to relevant passages in the Shastra, it was shown in the discussion of this verse that there are similarly no rules regarding place or bodily purity with respect to chanting Sri Bhagavan's name. Moreover, it was shown in this present section of Padyavali on the greatness of the name, or the Nam Mahatmya, that even if the name is not taken with Shraddha, that is, even if only a semblance of the name, or Nama Bas, is somehow uttered, one can still attain moksha as a result. To attain prema, however, that is, anuraga for Sri Bhagavan and his names, as discussed in the second verse of the Shikshastakam, one must become free from offenses. This is to say, although there are no rules regarding time, place, or bodily purity with respect to chanting Bhagavan's name with the aim of prema, there are rules pertaining to mental purity, meaning it is necessary for a chanter to foster an appropriate attitude wherein one's mind is free from offense as one chants. This next verse, the third verse of Shikshastakam, teaches that appropriate attitude by chanting the name with which one can become free from offenses and attain prema for Sri Bhagavan. Sri Sanatana Pad affirms this conclusion by citing this third verse of Shikshastakam at the end of his aforementioned commentary on the 10 offenses to Sri Bhagavan's name mentioned in Padma Puran, so as to imply the means to chant the name free from these offenses is taught in this verse. Sri Jiva Pad similarly states during his discussion of Kirtan in Bhakti Sandarbha that this verse has been taught by Sriman Mahaprabhu in regard to the proper manner in which to engage in Nama Sankirtan. Sri Jiva Pad also emphasizes the importance of a performer of Nama Kirtan having the proper attitude by elsewhere describing the outcome of the opposite. Quote, only obliviousness of Sri Bhagavan shall ensue for those who are offenders of the name because of an ingress of heresy, meaning offensiveness, therein. This is to say that those who commit offense to the name because of fostering a heretical mentality of intentional contrariety to Bhagavad Bhakti will only remain oblivious of Bhagavan even if they engage in Namakirtan or other practices of Bhakti as a result of their offenses. This is alluded to in Chaitanya Charitamrita as follows, quote, if one engages in hearing and chanting of Sri Bhagavan's names and so forth offensively for many births, one still does not attain the wealth of prema for Krishna's feet. The underlying principle is thus that it is not simply chanting the name of Sri Bhagavan, but chanting the name of Sri Bhagavan with the appropriate intent and attitude that can lead to the attainment of prema for Sri Bhagavan. Thus, it is stated elsewhere in Chaitanya Charitamrita, quote, if one takes the name without offense, one attains the wealth of prema. Non-offensiveness is therefore the fundamental criterion of eligibility to chant Sri Bhagavan's name in a manner that leads to the attainment of prema. And prema, along with the relish of Sri Bhagavan's madhurya that is made possible by prema alone, will manifest in the heart of a sadhaka to the extent that there is a state of non-offensiveness therein. The purpose of the instruction given and the qualities described in the third verse of Shikshastakam is thus to teach a sadhaka how to eschew offense. And because the attitude required to do so, taught in this verse, is fostered as part of the practice of Namasankirtan, the compiler begins a new section on this subject prior to citing the verse. Sorry, just checking one thing. Okay, so now we've now concluded the Nam Mahatmya section of the text, and we come to the following prakarana, which is called Namakirtana. So, Ata Namakirtanam. Now, Kirtan of the name. Tṛṇād sunīcena taror sahiṣṇunā amāninā mānadena kīrtanīyaḥ sadā hariḥ. Hariḥ is to be praised continuously by one who is far lower than even grass, tolerant more so than even a tree, free from conceit, and respectful to all as appropriate. So now we'll introduce this discussion of these four qualities. So the word Hari in this verse can be understood to refer specifically to the name Hari. That is, it can be interpreted to be an indicator of Sri Bhagavan's name Hari, as well as his various other names, like Krishna and Govinda. Or it can be understood to simply be a reference to Hari, that is, to the personhood of Sri Bhagavan. The instruction to perform kirtan in the verse can thus be understood to apply to kirtan of Sri Bhagavan's names specifically, and to all other forms of kirtan of Sri Bhagavan as well, such as kirtan of his qualities and leelas. So this is just, use of what is called upalakshana, or words that function as an indicator of categories to which they belong. So by prescribing these qualities as being necessary to do kirtan of Hari, does that mean kirtan of Hari meaning the name Hari, or does it just mean Hari in general? So we can understand it means both. And more broadly, as we'll see, even this mention of kirtan here isn't limited to kirtan. In other words, it's not that you need to be humble to do kirtan, but to do puja, you don't need to be humble. Or to do any other type of bhakti, then these qualities aren't necessary. That's not the idea. Rather, the mention of kirtan here is a representation of all forms of sadhana bhakti, and these qualities are essential to successfully practicing any of them. So now we'll look a little more closely at the word kīrtanīyaḥ. So in other words, we just looked at the intended sense of the word Hari. So now we'll look at the word kīrtanīyaḥ. The word kīrtanīyaḥ in the verse, translated above as, quote, to be praised, is formed by adding the aniyar affix or pratyay to the word kirtan. Sri Jiva Gosvami explains in his Harinamrita Bhakaran that the group of affixes to which the aniyar suffix belongs, which he refers to as Vishnu Krityas affixes, and which are referred to as Kritya affixes in other grammar systems, can be applied in a number of different senses, such as that of an injunction, vidhi. Among the other grammatically possible senses of application he lists, those of, quote, being worthy, arha, and being capable, shakti, are applicable in this case. Thus, the statement Hari is kīrtanīyaḥ, or Hari kīrtanīyaḥ, can convey the sense of an injunction, quote, Hari should be praised by one who is far lower than even grass, etc., as well as a sense of worthiness, quote, Hari is worthy of being praised by one who is so on and so forth, or a sense of capability, Hari is capable of being praised by one who is so on and so forth. Taking these different senses collectively, the statement Hari is kīrtanīyaḥ can be understood to convey both an injunction to perform kirtan of Hari and a rule regarding the eligibility for doing so, since the senses of capability and worthiness that the anyar suffix can express indicate that it is only when kirtan of Hari is performed by someone with the four qualities mentioned in the verse that the kirtan that is performed will be capable of being kirtan of Hari in the true sense and truly worthy of Hari. So this section I built off of a comment that was made in a book called Gambirai Sri Gauranga by Rasika Mohan Vidyabhushan. And he made a portion of this point, and I've elaborated on it a little bit, and he referred to another grammar text for the basis of it, but I used the references from Harinamrita Bakaran instead. So just a little bit of background on this idea, that when you apply a particular affix to a word to create a new word, then that affix has certain vrittis, or it has the ability to convey certain meanings. And then according to the context, one is meant to infer the tatparya, or the intended particular function that the affix has, which is intended by the speaker in that particular usage. So in this case, we find that multiple functions that the anyar suffix can convey are plausible and also appreciable with regard to this statement. So the idea that this is an injunction applies, or in other words, that Mahaprabhu this is the Shikshastakam, or the 8 verses of instruction. So he's giving an injunction about what a sadhaka should do given the plight that's described in the previous verse. And moreover, it's also something that can be understood to convey the spirit or the substance of what it means to actually do kirtan, or how worthy, what sort of kirtan is actually worthy of Bhagavan. So to do kirtan that's really worthy of Bhagavan, one requires these qualities in order to do it. So it's both a standard to be aspired to and a practice to be performed. And how that balance, or if you will, almost a catch-22 that can arise between the idea of needing these qualities in order to do kirtan that's worthy of Hari, and receiving an injunction to do kirtan with these qualities, even when one may not find that one has these qualities, or may not find that one has a great extent of these qualities. How that tension, so to speak, is balanced is something that we'll discuss later in this commentary. But I'm just laying it out, so to speak, in the beginning, that both elements are part of what's conveyed by the verse. It should also be understood more broadly that the discussion of kirtan in the verse is an indicator of other forms of bhakti sadhana as well. This is to say that the 4 qualities that are enjoined as necessary for the practice of kirtan in this verse should be understood to apply to the performance of all other forms of bhakti sadhana as well. Since the necessity of bhakti being performed free from aparad, which is the primary aim of the instruction given in this verse, is a principle of universal application with respect to all forms of Bhagavad Bhakti. The 4 qualities stated in the verse will now be discussed individually, moving in order from the latter to the former, so as to explicate how bhakti can be performed free from offense. Each of these qualities spoken of in the verse are stated as adjectives of an ideal performer of Hari Kirtan and declined in the instrumental case. Thus, the quality of respectfulness, or mānadena, is spoken of in the verse as, quote, by one who is respectful, mānadena. The quality of non-conceitedness, amāninā, is spoken of in the verse as, quote, by one who is free from conceit, amāninā. The quality of tolerance, sahiṣṇunā, is spoken of in the verse as, quote, by one who is tolerant more so than even a tree, taror api sahiṣṇunā, and the quality of humility is spoken of in the verse as, quote, by one who is far lower than even grass, Tṛṇād api sunīcena. So I'm just adding a little bit of grammatical reference here so that the core statements in the verse are very clear, so that these four qualities, which are meant, because these qualities are mentioned in the instrumental case, persons who aren't familiar with how words are declined in Sanskrit may find it a little bit challenging to understand what specifically is being laid out in the verse. So as we go through the commentary, it's given, so to speak, in a straightforward way, with the qualities mentioned directly as nouns in the nominative case. But to see how those nouns are there in the verse, in their instrumental form, I'm giving this slight elaboration. And I'm also just fixing one other mistake here. Okay. So, with that introduction, we'll now start discussion of the four qualities. So, we'll begin with respectfulness, or mānadena. The quality of respectfulness, mānadena, is discussed in the explanation of the verse under discussion in Chaitanya Charitamrita, initially as simply giving honor to others, as per a literal sense of the word mānada, which means giving honor, man. Sanskrit commentators on the verse under discussion, as well as Sri Sridhar Pad, Sri Sanatana Gosvami Pad, and Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad, in their commentaries on the word mānada in Srimad Bhagavatam 11.11.31, where this quality is listed among the qualities of a sadhu by Bhagavan Sri Krishna, all offered the same simple explanation. Later in Chaitanya Charitamrita, however, a more nuanced explanation of this quality is given that clarifies whom honor should be given to, and, crucially, the reason why the honor is to be given. Quote, one should give honor to the Jiva, knowing them to be a dwelling place of Krishna. So, to just say, be respectful, or give honor to others, then one may wonder, to whom? Does that mean to Vaishnavas and Vaishnavas only? Does that mean to human beings but not animals or not plants? Or who is intended to be the recipient of honor? And how much honor? And is there any exception where someone is not meant to be given honor? And how is the honor to be given? All of these things are, not explained by one word in the verse, mānadena, or giving honor, but to actually put this idea or this teaching of giving honor or being respectful into practice, we need to know who's to be given honor, when they're to be given it, how much they're to be given it, why they're to be given it, and when perhaps they might not be. So that's what we'll dive into in the course of this discussion. So what's very noteworthy here in this very simple statement in the Charitamrita is that honor is spoken of as being given to the Jiva. And the reason for, or the angle of vision, or the perspective on the basis of which the honor is being given is also specified. The idea that this Jiva is a dwelling place of Krishna. So here we have the proper object and the proper reason for giving honor to that object. So we'll go into some interesting subtleties in this regard. From this explanation, which may initially sound rather simple, it is to be understood that the type of respectfulness spoken of by Sriman Mahaprabhu in the verse under discussion is fundamentally not a form of conditional respect that is offered to a greater or lesser extent, based on the relative merits and demerits of the body, qualities, activities, and so forth of a potential recipient. Such conditional respect based on external judgment is undoubtedly prevalent in the world, but the offering of honor spoken of in the verse under discussion is fundamentally unconditional, rather than conditional, because it is based on recognition of the invariable, all-pervading presence of Sri Bhagavan within every entity throughout the universe, and is given specifically on account of that presence of Sri Bhagavan therein, as is described in Srimad Bhagavatam 6.4.13. Quote, the self, hariḥ, Ishvara, is present inside the bodies of all entities. Therefore, seeing everything, that is every entity, as an abode of his. See everything as an abode of his. In this way, he will certainly be pleased with you all. So, as we'll get to a little bit later, if we look at the way respect is conventionally given in society, it's given on the basis of qualities that are thought to be respectful in others. And not everyone is in agreement on what qualities make someone respectable. And even there's direct differences of opinion about what makes someone respectable. In the eyes of some, especially in, historically, having one type of skin color, in the opinion of some, made you a worthy recipient of respect and a worthy recipient of enslavement by others. Whereas, a particular quality might be considered more respectable by some, less respectable by others, such as some cultures frowned on the practice of drama and acting and wouldn't show great respect to persons skilled in that, whereas in today's society, movie actors are, lauded as celebrities and so on and so forth. So particular activities, particular character traits, particular bodily traits within the worldly context are all perceived to be of different degrees of respectability by different people. So none of that is what is referred to in this context of giving honor to jivas based on their being recipients, dwelling places of Krishna, or being pervaded by the presence of Krishna. Rather, we have a criterion for an unconditional offering of respect to every living being, to every particle of the animation of which we are a part. And that irrespective of any of the observable characteristics of any entity or object within our visible environment, all of it is to be fundamentally regarded as worthy of respect, because within it there is the presence of he who is the supreme object of honor and devotion, Sri Bhagavan. The deep significance of this perspective, whereby all entities are recognized as being possessed of the characteristic of honorability by virtue of Sri Bhagavan's presence within them, can be aptly appreciated through reference through reflection upon the existential condition of jivas in samsara. Quote, there are indeed innumerable entities constituted of the intermediary potency or tatastha shakti of Sri Bhagavan, known as jivas. In that regard, there are two classes of them. One class is intent upon Bhagavan, or Bhagavan Unmukha, verily beginninglessly, whereas the other is oblivious of Bhagavan, or Bhagavat Paranmukha, verily beginninglessly, because of the presence of awareness of him and the absence of awareness of him in their respective dispositions. In that regard, the first class is favored by an expression of the internal potency of Sri Bhagavan, and has the forms of eternal associates of Bhagavan, such as Garuda. The other class of jivas, on the contrary, is the samsari, that is, the jivas bound in samsara, overpowered by Maya on account of the acquired defect of the deficiency of obliviousness of him. From this passage, it is to be understood that the fundamental basis of a jiva's bondage and suffering in samsara is a lack of awareness of Sri Bhagavan. To show how such ignorance or avidya leads to the practical suffering experienced in daily life, Sri Sridhar Samipad and Sri Vishwanath Chakravartipad, in their commentaries on Srimad Bhagavatam, refer to the 5 types of affliction outlined by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, which can be summarized from a Gaudiya theological perspective as follows. 1. Avidya, ignorance, that is a lack of awareness of Sri Bhagavan and the essential nature of the self. 2. Asmita, egotism, that is a false sense of self that exists in the vacuum created by this ignorance of the real self and Sri Bhagavan. 3. Raga, attachment, that is attachment to objects in the world based on the false sense of self and the pursuit of pleasure for it. 4. Dvesh, enmity, that is aversion to objects in the world based on the false sense of self and the removal of impediments to pleasure for it. And 5. Abhinivesh, clinging to life or fearing death, that is engrossment in the false sense of self and the worldly life it leads. The aforementioned instruction to honor all entities as dwelling places of Sri Bhagavan thus serves to countervail the fundamental basis of bondage and suffering in samsara, because it makes awareness of Sri Bhagavan, that is, intentness or samukhyata upon the paratattva, which is the most fundamental directive or abhideya given in the Shastra for all jivas in samsara, integral to how one sees and interacts with every entity in the world. So, as we heard in the Bhakti Sandarbha, the fundamental abhideya, or the most fundamental universal instruction given by the Shastra, is to have awareness or to be intent upon the supreme reality, the ultimate manifestation of which is Bhagavan, and more specifically Swayam Bhagavan, Sri Krishna. And the fundamental defect as a result of which a jiva suffers in samsara is an absence of such awareness. So, by seeing every entity in the world to be pervaded by the presence of Bhagavan, one can integrate practice of this universal and most important fundamental directive of the Shastra into how one practically engages at every moment with every single feature of the environment in one's life. So this attitude or this perspective of seeing the world as being pervaded by Bhagavan, of seeing every person as having Bhagavan within them, is essential to living in accord with the abhideya of the Shastra. In other words, imagine the opposite. If you don't do that, what are you doing? You cannot but be interacting with another based on a superficial conception of the other in an oblivious state of Bhagavan, and in all likelihood acting on the basis of a superficial and ultimately false sense of self, that of the self being something other than a servant of Bhagavan. So by fostering this attitude or perspective of sustaining awareness or meditating on the presence of Bhagavan pervading everything, and then honoring things on the basis of that, in other words, integrating into one's practical behavior the outcome of that awareness of Bhagavan's all-pervading presence, one transforms, as I'll explain a little bit later in the text, all of the interaction that one has, all of the actions that one does, even in the practicality and simple exchanges of life, into things that actually foster the awareness and the practice of devotion that one is trying to pursue. So it's not that you practice bhakti only on your asan in your room with the door closed, and then you have to go out into the world, to the shop or to your job or whatever, and now you're just off doing something else. And that's not sadhana, or that's separate from this spiritual practice that you do. Rather, with this perspective, one finds that every single interaction that one has with every single feature of one's environment is actually an opportunity to put the practice of bhakti into action, and to act as though one is, so to speak, in front of one's Thakur, or just as one has the awareness of Bhagavan's presence when one is doing worship in front of one's Thakur, just like that, one can also foster the attitude and the feeling that one is interacting in the presence of Bhagavan while they're interacting with anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. And just as one is careful and attentive to, act so as to not cause disrespect while standing or performing worship in front of one's deity, just like that, one will also thereby acquire the sensitivity or the presence of mind to not act rudely, harshly, crudely, offensively in the presence of anyone, because one won't conceive of oneself as being outside the presence and the observation of one's Ishtadevata. So this attitude both gives someone a reason to honor and to act well with everything that one interacts with, and it also gives someone some caution or some sensitivity about the consequences of not doing so. And here, Jiva Gosvami Pad next states another important benefit of this attitude. Moreover, as Sri Jiva Pad explains, that looks like a typo. It serves to practically mitigate the effects of ignorance and identification with the false self as well. Quote, that too, that is honoring all beings, is to be understood as being enjoined for the purpose of bringing about prompt cessation of attachment and enmity towards other beings. So this quote here of Jiva Goswami is actually why I brought up just a minute ago the 5 types of klesh given in the Yoga Sutras, because this rag and dvesh are the primary, most deeply ingrained duality that the mind fluctuates between when one acts on the basis of the acquired sense of self related to the body and the subtle body within samsara. So unless and until one finds a way of interacting with one's environment and conceiving of one's environment outside this duality of rag and dvesh, all of one's activities only perpetuate that full sense of self and that ignorance that cause one's suffering. So one can uproot the whole process by removing the ignorance or removing the absence of awareness of Bhagavan, by bringing awareness of Bhagavan into everything, or seeing him pervading the totality of the environment. And then one can act on a sense of self that's not a full sense of self independent of Bhagavan, but rather a spiritual sense of self as a servant of Bhagavan. And then in one's interaction with all of these entities and objects within the environment, one isn't simply driven by attachment and aversion to them based on how they relate to the false self or to the body, but rather one can see a fundamental honorability and a fundamental importance in treating them with respect based on this spiritual perspective of them. And then by integrating that into one's practical behavior, one can succeed, and one has a means by which one can cease to act simply on this polarity or this duality of attachment and aversion, or attachment and enmity towards everything in one's surroundings. So because typically these attachments and these senses of enmity are what absorb the mind and what bind the mind into thought of vishoy, or thought of the mundane and the objects of the senses, by prioritizing this subtle perspective rather than the gross perspective of these entities, one can heal the mind, or one can direct the mind or steer the mind away from this typical strongly ingrained mode of conditioning and conception of objects, and thereby free oneself from absorption in such thought, as well as free oneself from the causes of harsh behavior, offensive behavior, harmful behavior towards others. So in gist, by honoring all beings based on seeing them as being pervaded by Bhagavan, one can bring about, here he says, prompt cessation of attachment and enmity. Sri Jiva further emphasizes this point in Bhakti Sandarbha by showing the consequences of lacking this attitude, as per descriptions given in statements of Bhagavan Kapila in Srimad Bhagavatam. And just as a heads up, many of the statements that we'll discuss in this discussion all come from Anucheda 106 of the Bhakti Sandarbha. For the most part, there are some from elsewhere, but that particular Anucheda has a very elaborate discussion of this subject, and I have to say is a personal favorite of mine within the whole discussion of the Bhakti Sandarbha, so I happily chose to integrate a number of points that I found very salient from that section into this discussion. Quote, "The mind of one who is hostile towards me," and this is Bhagavan speaking in first person, "the mind of one who is hostile towards me in all other bodies, that is, one who is of disunited vision, that is, one who is devoid of singular vision of my presence as the inner regulator, that is, the Paramatma everywhere, thus proud and thus bound by enmity towards other beings, does not attain peace. O sinless one, I am certainly not pleased when worshipped in the deity with rites, performed with variegated materials, by one who disrespects other living beings. Within the mind, one should offer obeisance to and greatly honor all these beings, considering, quote, Bhagavan Ishvara has entered all these beings by means of impelling the jivas. Or in other words, simply by the fact that they're animate, one can infer the presence of Bhagavan within them as the source of their animation. And what he's saying is that to, in isolation, worship him, meaning Bhagavan, in the form of the deity, but then treat people like trash or treat others disrespectfully, one who sustains this type of dualistic behavior doesn't please Bhagavan. So in this same section of the Bhagavatam, Kapila even says, until one learns to meditate on and recognize the presence of Bhagavan within all living beings and respect them accordingly, one is unqualified to engage in worship of the deity. So he then states that if one sustains an attitude of favorability towards Bhagavan in the deity, one can also in turn be hostile towards the other sites of Bhagavan's presence, namely other living beings. And by not being hostile towards them, rather by seeing them as abodes of Bhagavan, one reduces the pride or the sense of one being at liberty to act as though others are unworthy of honor and right treatment, and one becomes free from even enmity towards those persons, should even their behavior or some of their characteristics be less than desirable. And unless one becomes free from enmity towards others, one never feels peaceful within oneself. So if you want to feel peaceful, you have to be free from enmity. To be free from enmity, you have to see honorability within others, and you can see honorability within others by understanding that the presence of Bhagavan is there in them, and thus they're worthy of honor. So, more elaboration on this topic. Near the end of Bhakti Sandarbha, following the discussion of Raganuga Bhakti, Sri Jiva further elaborates on the subject of transcending attachment and enmity by means of honoring all living beings as dwelling places of Sri Bhagavan, by commenting on a number of statements of Bhagavan Sri Krishna that come at the end of his teachings to Sri Uddhava in the renowned dialogue between them in Srimad Bhagavatam, known as the Uddhava Gita. Quote, since people are generally prone to rivalry, or you could translate it as competition or envy, sparta, and so forth, that is, and other attitudes that foster behavior that is disrespectful to others and focused on the pursuit of superiority over them. And considering that even if they somehow become inward-facing, antarmukhi, that is, endowed with awareness and intentness upon Bhagavan, samukhyata, they typically have knowledge only of worship of you, that is Bhagavan, in the form of the inner regulator, or antarjami, of all. You graciously teach them worship of yourself, that is, of yourself specifically as Sri Bhagavan, in place of, that is, instead of, the worship of your own expansion in the form of the inner regulator, that is Paramatma, described in Bhagavad Gita 10:42. Quote, with a single portion of myself as the Paramatma, I am present pervading the entirety of this universe. So as to quickly dispel their rivalry and so forth, and make them inward facing towards you yourself specifically, that is, towards yourself in your aspect as Sri Bhagavan, in contrast to your aspect as Paramatma, as follows. Quote, one of untainted heart should see me alone to be externally and internally present, and to be the self in the self and in all beings, unrestrained like the sky. So this is a very beautiful expression, and Jiva Gosvami clarifies here in this verse that one should see, quote, me alone, mam eva, means that one should see the form of Sri Krishna alone, and not rather only the form of the inner regulator, or Paramatma. So what's very interesting here is that for followers of the path of bhakti, and as he's already explained, the path of Raganuga bhakti at this stage in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he's then, after having spoken about Raganuga bhakti, also come back to the practicality of living in the world and of dealing with this environment that we live in, and giving this very beautiful instruction about how to integrate this pursuit of constant awareness, or sammukhya upon Bhagavan, in its most applicable or ultimate form, in the form of Raganuga bhakti, into even one's interaction with all the entities and objects in the world, by seeing them to be pervaded not just by what we can theologically infer to be the presence of the Paramatma, but rather to see them to be pervaded by Bhagavan, by Sri Krishna, by one's Ishta Devata himself. So it doesn't matter if the person that you see your Ishta Devata to be in the heart of is actually a bhakta of your Ishta Devata or not. That's not the point. In other words, it doesn't matter what people think. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter what their mentality is. It doesn't matter if it's even an insentient object. Still, the bhakta following this path will see that presence of the Ishta Devata, that presence of Krishna pervading everything. They'll, by their inclination, by virtue of their pursuit of their one-pointed object of ultimate attainment, perceive the environment in that way, and in the wake of that, or the benefit of that, is that then everyone else will be enriched by you behaving so as to honor that supreme Ishta Devata in your practical dealings with them. So look how good it turns out for everybody. In other words, they get you on your best behavior, irrespective of what their character, behavior, or treatment of you is. So this works out wonderfully in the favor of everyone, and it works out very well in your favor because it enables you to integrate your interaction with everything into the development or into your own practice of sadhana bhakti. So it's common, and we see, by reference, no doubt, justifiably, to many statements in Shastra, that even sadhaka bhaktas who consider themselves followers of the Goswamis or Gaudiya Vaishnavism speak about the Paramatma as the allocator of karma and as the being present in everyone, and that's all fine. But here, Jiva Goswami, he's not writing that off or saying that that's a wrong understanding, but he's saying that practically speaking, that's not an ideal understanding for a sadhaka. The sadhaka, whose one-pointedness is upon their Ishta Devata, upon Bhagavan, should actively apply that type of perspective to the way they see the world. Not that the Ishta Devata is off there in Goloka Vrindavan and here in the world of samsara there's only Paramatma. That vision, while it might be theologically acceptable, is not actually ideally practical from considering the interest of what will be most conducive to a sadhaka's purification and development. So I have a couple more points in this regard. Sri Jiva Pad's point here is profound. A sadhaka is taught to see, that is, meditate on the presence of not just the Paramatma, but Bhagavan, and more specifically Sri Krishna, and even more specifically one's Ishta Devata, that is, the specific form of Bhagavan whom one has accepted as one's object of worship, as being all-pervasively present in the hearts of all beings, regardless of whether the beings in whom one's Ishta Devata is meditated to be present within actively foster any awareness or bhakti to one's Ishta Devata or any other feature of the Paratattva. Bhagavan Sri Krishna further elaborates on this point in a subsequent statement. Quote, "The rivalry with peers, envy towards superiors, and disdain towards juniors, along with egotism in oneself, of a person who meditates on my constant presence in all human beings, including oneself, certainly vanishes before long." So this is what makes our life miserable. Egotism, disdain, envy, rivalry, these are all causes of, unrest within the mind and, a lack of contentment. So here's a beautiful, simple, universal meditation to heal those things, to meditate on the constant presence of one's Ishta Devata within everything, within everyone. And here, that very Ishta Devata, that very Bhagavan Sri Krishna is saying that by doing so, then all these different disorders of the mind will soon vanish. They'll soon be cured by this attitude. So when one sustains awareness of the presence of Sri Bhagavan, and more specifically one's Ishta Devata, in every entity with whom one interacts, one will be impelled to act not on the basis of various forms of attachment or enmity that any given entity's presence, character traits, actions, and the like may enkindle in one's own mind in concert with one's own samskaras and vasanas, but rather be impelled to act by the bhakti vasana that a sadhaka is ever striving to nourish in the course of one's bhakti sadhana. This shift in focus and awareness results in all of one's social interactions becoming opportunities to purify the mind of non-devotional samskaras and nourish one's bhakti vasana. That is, it results in the opportunity to transform all of one's social interactions into spiritually enriching exchanges by making them means by which one can deepen one's relationship, awareness, and devotion to one's Ishta Devata. By shifting focus away from the particular appearances, traits, behaviors, and other adjunctive characteristics of entities in general, and people specifically, such as their race, sex, ancestry, nationality, class, and so on, and putting the focus on their honorability by virtue of Sri Bhagavan's presence within them, one can become equanimous even in the midst of a challenging and ever-shifting social environment, and thus have a means to genuine behavioral change. So, I have more on this topic. Krishna gives even some strong instructions to perform this practice. And then we'll look at more of the implications of this practice, as well as some of the details about how to practically apply this practice in the continued discussion. But it looks like we're out of time for today, so I'll pause here, and if anyone has any comments or corrections, questions, what have you, please feel free to share.
Pranam, Baba.
Pranam.
It's Anuradha here. So are we can? I guess it's yet to come as to how exactly to practice seeing one's Ishtadev in all beings. Yes, is it yet to come?
Yes, there'll be some more discussion of that, but in general, the point is made insofar as there isn't like an exact meditation technique that's given anywhere in these statements of the Goswamis. It's simply told like that one will see, quote unquote, see in the sense of bear in mind or consider there to be his presence there, and that one will like visualize his figure being superimposed over the person's heart, or there isn't any direct instruction like that. If someone wanted to engage in some sort of more rich visualization or something like that, perhaps it's not out of the question. But just as the name is to be remembered consistently, then similarly to sustain that awareness in the course of one's perception of the environment and interactions with others. Like this, it's a general recommendation.
Yes, because it's a real tall order, and easier said than done, especially when as much as we try to avoid a satsanga sometimes in day-to-day life, you cannot avoid having to deal with certain persons of unsavory characters, and then have to remember that one's Ishtadev is sitting in the heart of that person. It's such a rasabhasa, such a mix, for lack of a better word.
Well, one perspective on that is that's where it really comes in handy. or in other words, when we're dealing with a situation or a person who's being harmful to us or being rude to us, or, then when the enmity, the dvesh, thoughts of that arise in the mind, then to also bear in mind that this person is blessed with the presence of Bhagavan within them. This person is also worthy of respect, that I can also, interact with this person in a way that's not simply driven by the immediate reaction that I might have to a particular behavior that they express. That's how we can also have a view of compassion towards that person, to see them in the context of their potential, that this person might be behaving in a very unsavory way at this moment, but they're also a jiva who's pervaded by the presence of Bhagavan, and by the grace of a sadhu, this person could also become so worshipable. This person could also become filled with so many wonderful qualities. Like there's a Protestant saying, I think it comes from a prominent Protestant preacher in the maybe 15 or 1600s named John Bradford, who he would sometimes look at the news or hear about great misbehaviors or crimes committed or something like that. But he had this saying, "There by the grace of God goes John Bradford," which is sometimes modified into a saying, "There by the grace of God goes I." In other words, if I hadn't received the grace that I've received, I could very well be acting just like that person is. If this person is acting very, badly, I could also easily be in that very same situation. And it's actually only because of the grace of my Ishtadevata coming through such and such sadhu or such and such person that I have the mental conditioning and the disposition and the presence of mind to not act like that. So I'm not actually superior to this person or greater than this person or fit to look down upon this person. I'm just lucky to not be in the situation that they are in. So to see them in the context of the potential that they have, and to see that they too, in the context of eternity, within even a very short time, could become, a person who behaves in a very different way that would evoke great feelings of gratitude and respect and adoration from me. That's also very much possible, and that very Ishtadevata of mine, that very Sri Krishna who can make the impossible possible, is also there, is also within them, and they fall within the scope of where His grace can fall, so to speak. So, from one perspective, it's difficult to evoke that awareness in those acute times of challenging circumstances, but in another perspective, or when we're able, that also can be one of the instances in which we gain the most from this type of sadhana, because it's in circumstances of acute challenge that sometimes our lower tendencies or our yet to be fully purged faults come out in less than pleasant forms or in embarrassing forms. So these type of practices are also there to preclude such reactions on our part. So a few thoughts perhaps related to the topic.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I see another hand.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for presentation. No, I'm listening to this, and I'm kind of realizing that actually this description of a liberated person to act in equanimity to all living entities, to see the Lord everywhere, to be equipoised, those are the qualities of a liberated person. So I'm just thinking, is there any because when you said, today we'll be talking about how to obtain effect of chanting Nam, which is prema. What's the process? And the process is actually, what you presented is actually a description of a liberated person, which I find myself unqualified to practice, to conceive even of me acting artificially. I may be acting artificially to see myself, as you described, in between living entities, see them as a part of Krishna. I may try as much as I can, but will I succeed? Because unless there's a grace of Nam, then one will always fail. One who is situated in modes of material nature, which is most of us. So I'm just thinking that there must be, our effort is important, I understand that, but there's something like grace that actually uplifts and grants the effect of Nam, prema. Is it correct to think like that?
Yeah, this exact tension that you're describing is something that we're going to discuss with more detail soon. And I've also included some nice discussion of Chakravarti Pad related to the 12th chapter of Gita, where we get like an incremental, direct set of practices that can bring the sadhaka who's asked to perform sadhana with qualities that they quote unquote don't have, or asked to do something that they don't yet have the means to do, or to confront this apparent catch-22, and how grace, effort, the purifying power of bhakti all gel together to bring the sadhaka through this stage of struggle. This is precisely where we'll discuss in the course of the coming classes. So we'll definitely have more to say about that. And in essence, the idea is that yes, ultimately these qualities and this type of respectfulness that's being described is fully and naturally done by a Siddha Purush, and yet at the same time, the sadhaka who may be far thoroughly conditioned by the mundane is nevertheless told to act that way, because as it is said that the characteristics of the siddha is the sadhana of a sadhaka. So it's not that.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
What is it? Siddhasya lakshanam yat sadhaka sadhanam tat, I believe is the statement. It's cited by Sanatana Gosvami in a commentary on the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, that the lakshanas, or the characteristics of the siddha, are the sadhana of the sadhaka. So, although it might not quote-unquote be natural or genuine for a sadhaka to act or think this way, nevertheless, it's their practice to try or to aspire to do so, and it's through the samskaras built by that practice, as well as you definitely mentioned, the purifying influence of bhakti, or the grace of bhakti, that combination of the two, that serve to recondition the psyche. So it is a struggle, and if it weren't a struggle, it would be not so difficult to succeed, or it would be not so difficult to swim across this ocean of samsara. So there's no claim that it's easy, but nevertheless, there's an attempt in the course of discussing these things to appreciate the beauty of them, and therefore inspire ourselves to take up the tall task.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so but what I'm hearing is that that this is not really a sadhana, but rather like positioning oneself in a certain imitative mode and hoping that this will work out. Basically, at which point one will actually do what we're just hearing now, not feeling I'm a pretender, because I'm so below that, and the ideal is so high. For me to try to, imitate the activities of siddha, at which point they become like, me doing them, becoming pretending, basically. Am I pretender by doing that? By imitating?
I mean, right. These are direct injunctions for sadhakas. If they weren't that, they wouldn't be given like this. So it's not a question of pretending. It's not a question of doing something that you're unfit for. This is Jiva Gosvami giving injunctions to sadhakas.
Yes.
So this is something that actually has to be done if one wants to follow this path. And one might find it difficult, one might find that it doesn't come naturally, but that doesn't mean that one scraps the process or thinks that they're doing something deleterious and, imitative in a negative sense. What's more honorable, what's more in tune with the principal abhideya of the Shastra than sustaining constant awareness of Bhagavan in one's perception of everything? What's more pure and ideal than that? That is the essence of the entire thing. So it might be, like what you might call, might have a lot of static in it, or the mind might waver on and off of it a lot in a heavily conditioned state. But that doesn't mean one shouldn't try, and that doesn't mean one isn't highly benefited by any amount of effort that one puts into the practice. And it's not that one is imitating or imagining something that isn't there. One is cultivating an awareness that's extremely healthy and extremely conducive to an ideal form of behavior. And we see that, I don't want to make an unnecessary generalization, but I'll just say that if people make a demarcation between the motivation for their behaviors and the fundamental principle of sadhana, which is to always remember Bhagavan and never forget him, then that demarcation leads to a non-ideal or not the process of the cultivation of qualities that's actually what our acaryas teach. In other words, it's not that remembering Bhagavan, hearing about Bhagavan, chanting about Bhagavan is over here, and then we need to practice being tolerant and humble over here, and that they're somehow two separate items. As we'll get to in the discussion that comes, it's actually only as a result of meditation and awareness of Bhagavan that these qualities in their genuine form come to manifest. That they're actually outcomes of the extent to which one does this principle abhideya of achieving consistent awareness of Bhagavan in the course of all one's thoughts and perceptions. This is the thing, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, it's not that we can say, oh, that's too much for me, let me, practice, meritorious behavior and virtue in a conventional sense. That might seem accessible to someone at a particular stage, but that's not actually the way that this whole process is meant to be cultivated. And it'll come in a couple of classes soon. We'll get to a section of Chakravartipad's commentary on the Gita where he goes into a lot of very practical detail about how incrementally one can work towards this level of awareness. In other words, it's not that you just go from 0 to 100, but that there are practices and incremental means by which this transition and by which the intensity of one's practice can mature.
Yes. Because what I really think that beside that ideal behavior and modeling one's consciousness is one, the other part is that strong prayerful mood while chanting the name, consider the name as one Om Ishtadev actually, that the name is the one that actually purifies. Please, in praying, chanting, while praying, please make me qualified, please make me clear, please make me tolerant. So I see this more practical than just trying on one's own, seeing equipoised position of my mind and tolerating everybody. I might try to do that, but I think that the grace is, while trying, it's a more significance than actually one trying. Actually asking for grace while trying has prominent value. In my experience, of course, I'm not questioning the values of what you say. I'm just saying. And I'm ready to hear more.
Yes, that's a subject which will also be discussed later on. As we go through these qualities, then the attitude or more fundamental orienting approaches by which these qualities come and the role of grace in that will also get to more of that. So
right.
I think you'll find that appreciable as well.
Yes. And also everyone, side point, because in the beginning of the class you mentioned that you're going through Tika of Viracandra Gosvami, and then at one point you were reading from Tika of Radha-Krishna Gosvami, if I don't remember correctly. And sometimes you just make commentaries. I'm not sure if those are your own or researched commentaries, combination of different tikas, or because I'm losing track of which tika we're reading.
Okay, I explained my methodology when I introduced the whole course. I follow. I study the commentary of Viracandra Gosvami on every verse, and in some cases I render what he says, in some cases I render parts of what he says, and in some cases I choose to omit some of his remarks. And in many cases I add relevant statements from the works of the Goswamis as per my understanding of what's relevant or what explains why Viracandra Gosvami says what he says, and in some cases which makes other important and insightful points regarding the subject matter of the verses. So in this case, of the Tṛṇād sunīcena verse, his commentary is very short and very literal. So I've included a couple of the points that he makes, but this is, you could say, a dramatic departure from what little he writes, and an attempt to present many of what I consider very important points made in the works of the Goswamis on this extremely important verse. But in other cases where, there isn't as much practical necessity, but there's just interpretation of a particular verse in a poetic sense, then there isn't much to elaborate on. So for the most part, I might just render what his commentary has and not add anything. But regarding that commentary on Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavita Mati, there I incorporated so many points from Jiva, Vishwanath, Radhakrishna Goswami, and others to augment. And in one case, if you remember, I made a concluding statement which was basically a long explanation of why Viracandra Gosvami said what he said. So for the most part, I find his commentary very appreciable and very insightful, but not in every case. And in some points I choose to omit with all due respect. And of course, readers are more than welcome to refer to the commentary themselves and come to their own conclusions.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeremy.
All right, well, let's conclude for today, and we'll continue. I don't know how many sessions it'll take, but we'll gradually make our way through many of these, which basically is stringing together a bunch of practical considerations and practical teachings found throughout the Goswami's works as to how to put these four qualities into practice, or how they can actually come and become revealed within one's heart, mind, and behavior. So that's our aim and purpose in the course of this discussion. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.